Providence Ventures. He focuses on investments in healthcare technology, technology-based services, and digital health. And he's currently on the board as a board advisor at Binary Fountain and Wildflower Health. He has also done deals. He was in the deal structuring and deal management, etc. Probably a lot of work in the diligence as well. Companies which were sold, in demand, interpreting, intelligent retinal managing, etc., etc. Big list of companies there. He spent 5 years in UBS Investments Bank in global healthcare department and so on group, and he has graduated from the famous Tepper School of Business at Carnegie Mellon University with a BS, and he is active in a lot of the non-profit and other organizations as well. And now, please take over, Cyril.
Yeah.
Introduce the people however you want.
Yeah, well, really appreciate that overview.
And then you have 1 hour. You have 1 hour, full 1 hour. To 11:50 to 12:50. Yeah.
Yep. Great. Thank you. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for the opportunity to be on this panel that's focused on AI in healthcare. Your team has pulled together a really great set of experts here, ranging from startups to provider organizations to large entities. And so I think the discussion that we have planned for today is going to be pretty insightful to our audience. Really what we want to do here is just, address some of the challenges that AI technologies face with adoption within healthcare, then move on to kind of talk a little bit about some of the areas that we see are ripe for disruption from a technology standpoint, and then try to close out the session with just some predictions more broadly about how this space will evolve moving forward. So before kind of jumping into the panels, in terms of logistics, feel free to submit questions in the Q&A portion. What our group is going to do is, after the presentation is complete, we're going to pull together a blog post and publish answers to those questions. That way, we can utilize the full hour to kind of have our panelists provide you all with information. So when you tag in a question, just make sure to note who you're addressing it to. That way, we could address those after the fact. So with that, I'm going to jump into introductions here. I'm going to have the panelists just do short intros on each of them themselves. So I'll start off with Michael.
Great, thanks, Cyril. I'm really excited to be part of this panel and part of what looks like a great conference. My background originally is software development. Then I decided I'd go into the wet side of things and did brain research for a bunch of years. Then kind of switched, and because I couldn't really make up my mind, decided I'd just lead a couple of different organizations so I could do everything at once. So I've been running a couple startups. The first was in life science, so in analyzing drug discovery, and that involved AI in a way that was pretty interesting. We had a bunch of people online doing image analytics of different things they used to do in the lab, so they could do it anytime, anywhere. And then we had AI on the back end that's replicating what the people were doing. So that was kind of a crowdsourced interchange between people doing analytics and the AI doing those analytics. And that really improved the consistency and the quality of analyzing these different images, and provided kind of a gateway into the next startup that I've been working on, and that's Mindshare Medical, where we're doing diagnostics via CT scans to start with in cancer screening, both in breast cancer and in lung cancer. And that kind of came out of that image analytics in a way. We started to use AI to discover novel biomarkers. So instead of replicating what the people were doing, we kind of went beyond that to find things that people didn't know to look for, or were not able to see with their eyes. So that's kind of my background. It's a mixture of technology development, product development, and like I said, going too many directions at once.
Great, thanks, Michael. Rohan, do you want to go next?
Sure, yeah, hard act to follow, but very nice to meet everybody and super excited to be here. My name is Rohan Dsouza. I'm currently at Olive. We're focused on robotic process automation, and our mission is to do, I guess, really not what would be classified as the super cool stuff in the AI space, but very applied. Healthcare has a lot of waste and opportunities for performance improvement. So we apply robotic process automation to come in and hopefully take $1 trillion out of healthcare and put it back in the hands of budget owners to invest back into their systems versus things that are sort of mundane and routine. Prior to this, I was leading product and customer deployments for a machine learning startup here based in Seattle by the name of Kensai. I led their product strategy and product deployment out to some of the largest health systems in the country, also in the NHS in Singapore, and doing some really, really interesting stuff. One of my big initiatives there was tackling data in healthcare that was actually never built for analytics and machine learning, and how to apply that to make sense out of it. My background's in pure sciences, epidemiologist by training, and now in the software world. So thank you.
Thanks, Rohan. Maryam, do you want to go next?
Sure. Maryam, I lead the product development at Providence, product development and operations team, responsible for incubation, commercialization, and also growth of our consumer digital products. I mentioned commercialization because whatever we build, we actually make that available to other health systems as well. I'm also responsible for the application of advanced technologies such as AI, ML, to bring access and convenience to our consumers' health, and also making caregiving easier for our providers. Prior to Providence, I did a couple of startups in the healthcare space, and before that, I worked at Microsoft. I actually worked on the planning stages of Cortana, the assistant, and also search and discovery. So that's another area where we did use AI and ML. Look forward to the panel discussion.
Great, thanks, Maryam. And then I'll pass over to Srini, but you have the best background, I think. So I'll pass it over to you.
So that's what tech allows us to do. Cyril and the panel, what a fantastic opportunity, and I'm sure we'll have a very insightful discussion. About my background, I now run products and design for Claris, which is one of the enterprise low-code division within Apple. And as many of you know, low-code is now the dominant secular trend that allows people without any development skills, what we sometimes refer to as citizen developers, as the business developers, to go build the software and to achieve the transformational outcomes that's needed. And in fact, healthcare, education are some of the primary industries where this is very applicable. But my background previously, I was very fortunate to be part of building several successful startups in the infrastructure space, where healthcare was one of the largest segments of the market. Most recently, it was a company called Sky High Networks. We were the leaders in creating the cloud security market. And then we later got acquired by McAfee. And before it was part of building all kinds of infrastructure, security, networking, data privacy, virtualization, and the cloud. And I also sometimes refer to as in the early days, I wasted 6 years between Microsoft and Bell Labs, but actually Microsoft gave me the foundation. In addition to the technology, as you can see from my background, yoga is also one of my biggest passions. And just as a side tidbit, I did compete in USA Yoga National Championship. I came third in California, and then I went to this stuff. So, and I think yoga plays a bigger role in the healthcare movement.
I agree.
Well, really appreciate everyone doing the introductions. I think we have a really great panel here. And so I'm going to dive into kind of the first area that I mentioned at the front end, which is just the challenges in the healthcare market for adoption of new technology, specifically AI. And so, I've been in the healthcare industry for over 10 years now, and the pace of adoption of new technologies has been very slow, maybe less than a snail sometimes. And so I think, looking at the industry overall, there's a lot of different constituents, and luckily on this panel, we have kind of a good group of them. And so, for startups with innovative tech solutions, as well as for startups with innovative solutions, they tend to end up like with the most hard job in terms of trying to get those into large health systems or large customers. And so the question I have for both Rohan and for Michael, given that both of you work at startups, is just, how is the adoption curve varied, and what have you seen in terms of challenges that you face whenever you sell into your respective constituencies, specifically with respect to AI type technologies? So Rohan, I'll have you kind of jump in first, and then Michael, you can follow up.
Yeah, Cyril, thank you for that question. Great question. I think I'll keep it short and sweet. It's no secret that it's super hard to get into healthcare, especially with a lot of the aura and the promise and the perceived value around artificial intelligence, broadly speaking. And we're talking at a pretty high altitude here. We're not going down and into the details. I think the unfortunate thing, and the thing that I spend most of my time with, is I think the term is extremely bastardized. It doesn't have a true definition to it. And I actually spend the majority of my time really working on trying to tell people that, look, AI is not this shiny object or silver bullet that's going to come and solve all your problems. We have to think of this as being a potential assistant or assistive sort of system to everything that you have acquired over years and years and years of training. And we're nobody to come in here and tell you to do something very different, but we are here to potentially challenge the status quo. So a lot of it is just coming in and having that perception. But to answer your question around sort of the onboarding or the life cycle, you have to be ready to be willing to take these in increments and start off small. My advice to most startups and to most other entrepreneurs in this space is stay true to your word. Don't promise the moon and deliver just the top of an oak tree, right? Stay focused on what is it that you're really good at. Ask for equal amount of commitment from your health system partners. I happen to be mostly on the health system side throughout my career. And as long as you can show a journey towards achieving that, and being there with them as a trusted partner, I think that there's a real great benefit to this being applied and broadly being dispersed across the organization.
Yeah, I mean, that's really a good perspective, specifically around kind of the term of AI sometimes causing a little bit of heartburn. Michael, it'll be interesting to get kind of your perspectives on that, as well as given your experience selling on the clinical side versus, Olive and Rohan's experience on more kind of operational focus type solutions. It would be great to kind of get your perspective on this.
Yeah, thanks, Cyril. Those are great points, Rohan. I think one of the things in our initial applications in radiology directly, and the real talk in radiology was replacing radiologists. And that's, it came out of the health economist, it came out of Silicon Valley. It's like, okay, it really made a lot of radiologists think about their jobs. There were people, and there was a study of this, that were deciding not to go into radiology because there wouldn't be any more radiologists. It's kind of ridiculous to think about it that way, because a spreadsheet didn't replace an accountant. It's an always evolving set of capabilities that clinicians are doing. And it's really key as a developer, somebody who wants to get things adopted, to enhance the value of the people that you're selling to. So essentially, the idea is taking AI or any other kind of technology and saying, how can I improve what I do? And another key part of that is saying, well, how are you measured? How do you look at what's important for doing your job today? And in radiology, clinical performance is one, but it may be tied with speed. The radiologist is under tremendous pressure to read a ton of scans. So if you think of those two issues and think of who benefits from increased speed and increased clinical value, then the AI is something that they need to trust. And that then is the real underlying key. And how do doctors trust new things? it's publications. It's the same kind of thing that's been going on for, hundreds of years before AI. So I think the underlying viewpoint is that really you have to build a strong foundation of trust by showing that your product has a performance that's going to help them do their job. And once that happens, I have felt very little resistance to use of products in the clinic.
Cyril, can I add something to it?
Yeah, feel free.
Yeah. So this is the most profound question. And in fact, I just gave a talk on AI and big tech disruption in the healthcare industry just before this. And the way I framed it is the transformation is all about a doctor-centric healthcare to data plus doctor-centric healthcare. I think it's a D to D square is what I see is the pattern that is emerging. I think in the early days, as Michael kind of brought it out, which is like doctors, some of the doctors that I talk to, they're afraid of data, and there is this misconceived perceptions about a data or the AI is going to come in and take their jobs, and then that kind of sentiment forced many of the doctors to kind of put a defensive posture, or it's like, I don't trust the data, or I don't trust the AI. And then the other side of the thing, when I work in the Valley and with the VCs, they basically have a pre-existing bias against doctors, because what they think that is like, they follow some of the conventional wisdom. In fact, some of the leading VCs, they basically say like, if you're trying to build a new healthcare startup, if there is a doctor on your team, I'm not going to fund you. I need biochemists and mathematicians, to be part of the new thing, because that's what they think that is the disruptive thinking. The truth is somewhere in the middle. The truth is the doctors need to be not rather pushing the technology out. I think, they need to embrace the technology. And at the end of the day, what is medicine? It is actually looking at the data and let the data inform your insights of, about the diagnosis and the care and so on and so forth. If you approach it that way, then AI and the data are the tools. And in fact, every software industry right now, the core plumbing is AI. Every aspect of the industry, no matter what it is, whether it's retail, education, we are in the world of data-driven and AI-driven software. And it's the plumbing of every software that's being built. So if you approach it that way, it's like now you have more data, and the data enables you to do better insights and better actions. And in fact, I even go to the extent that the future medical schools should have a mandatory AI as a curriculum. That's the only way that actually transform it. So, but to summarize, I think right now we are at the two polars of the opinion where doctors don't trust the technology and the tech don't trust thing. The future is where it is truly D plus D, is the data plus doctor, and that's the future that represents the opportunity.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that perspective, and luckily for us, we have a provider or two provider system members on this panel, and so I agree with kind of that focus around data, being kind of the end factor for kind of decision making, but there are kind of unique challenges and things that provider systems look for whenever we talk to any vendor. And so whenever my team on the venture side is evaluating any solutions on the tech side or AI focused, we always loop in Maryam because she's the expert in that realm for us. And so it would be great to get your perspective, Maryam, on kind of what's been said so far around that, and what you look for when you're evaluating companies, and the ones that you feel get the most traction.
Sure. And Cyril summarized it really well. So my team actually is a team of product managers, designers, software engineers. So we often do a build by partner analysis. And if there is a startup out there, and I have run a startup, so I understand that you don't have everything right away. But if it's a startup out there that we can trust, we basically integrate them into our solutions. So what are the things we look for? Number one is, are they addressing the right problem? And the way for us to start as a health system, just to give you some context, we actually go through the problems before even talking to startups. We work very closely with our strategy team and clinical team to say, here are a set of problems we are looking for. And that's sort of the first step where we go high level. We actually go down to the details of what are the use cases. And then the next step is to work very closely with our venture team to scan the market and say, are there startups that can potentially meet that needs? And when we talk to those startups, number one thing is to understand what problem they're actually solving. And I'll tell you that it's a very interesting world, especially for those of you who have done product management. Often you realize that people don't know what problems they're solving because they're not going down to the use cases. And I think earlier Rohan mentioned, this misconception about AI and machine learning. The problem is that people think about AI as the general complex AI that is going to replace humans. And really we need to think about narrow AI and which use cases it can cover and really start with the problem. So number one is that, Cyril, to answer your question. Now, it's a startup. I know they have a long journey. So obviously we need to trust the team, and we do look at the composition of the team. We look at, where they are in that journey, and our venture team helps me very closely in getting those details. But in terms of the solution, there needs to be metrics. And what's been interesting, I see two different groups of startups. Some of them come and I can ask them about, machine learning metrics, sensitivity, specificity, what's your area under curve? Give me the metrics, show me that actually technically the solution that you have work. But we know that often the technical metrics don't mean that actually is working for consumers and providers. So I would say as a startup, think about your technical metrics, because I am going to ask those questions, and then think about if, for example, is a consumer facing solution you're selling, what are the engagement metrics? Can actually consumers complete their task? And that's a really hard part, because you need your first case studies to kind of prove that something has worked, but is actually needed. The other thing actually, Srini, I want to go back to the comment you made. When I joined Providence 2.5 years ago, I was in the same boat. Like, why can't providers, learn more about AI and come on board? But what I realized is that the interesting thing, especially as we go to deep learning, AI is not easily explainable. So if I want to, I'm actually going through this process right now. And let me tell you that I have two sides. A part of me feels a lot of empathy for providers. And then a part of me is like, why can't you just get it? We are going through differential diagnosis, and they're like, well, can you tell me how this works? How is it evaluating? If I had a rule-based algorithm that I could just say, well, here's how it works, go through, say, Thomson-Schmidt protocol, that would be the easiest thing to do. But it's not the case. So I think as technologists, we need to think about this area. How do we explain AI to all these professionals, where it's not quite explainable and it's not a dark, black box for them. You mentioned how we evaluate Cyril, and I think a few of the folks in the panel talked about trust. One of the things that's very important for us as a provider is we have to earn the trust of our patients, and we need to maintain that. So we are going to do whatever best is for the patients. And in that picture, then, because we are dealing with lives, because we are dealing with patients at a vulnerable time, it's very important that the startups have done their due diligence to meet the regulations. There's a lot of discussion around data privacy and what happens. You should do your homework there, because definitely security, everybody else is going to be working with us. Now, I'll tell you where most of the startups fail when they come to a discussion. If they have a technology background, clinical workflows are king in healthcare. And I see even serial entrepreneurs who are not aware of how the end-to-end things works in a workflow. And then how does it actually connect with the rest of the health system? And one of the challenges is that about EMRs, and Cyril, you hear my complaints about integration with EMRs and how do we get the data back, or they're not even ahead. Regardless, whatever as a startup you do, you need to think about continuity of care, because that's needed for the patient and the providers, and make sure that there is integration with the system. In regards to trust, there is one more thing to consider that I have gone through as I was looking at folks who have done, for example, differential diagnosis. is to really consider bias. If you got 1 million records from one location and you build your models on top of that, and you're going to come and tell me it works, you need to explain to me why that 1 million records was good to build your model, and how do you go about testing it. So be prepared to talk about the details. Often the technical folks are not on the call, and I give it 1 or 2 calls, and that's about it. So that's my advice.
I appreciate that, Maryam. There were a couple of things that you mentioned there that I actually want to pose towards Michael, just kind of given his background. I think first is just, just how do you explain this type of technology that you do, which is on the image analysis side, and clinicians are the ones who are using it. Like, how do you explain it so that the physicians understand how it works, and they get to that trust level that Maryam was referring to? Because I think again, like when it's gets to patient interactions, utilizing AI that maybe it's not fully understood seems to be kind of a challenge that's out there. And so it would be great to kind of get your perspective on that, Michael.
Yeah, thanks, Cyril. I'm glad you pointed over to me, because I didn't in my previous comments plug the fact that I'm giving a talk on exactly these issues at 1:30. so thanks for that. But obviously everybody can't go to that. So just to summarize quickly a couple things about it, I think what Maryam brought up is also a key difference. Some of the AIs are replacing what the clinician can do. So it's helping them in efficiency and in workflow, or eliminate some mistakes. And those are things then that the clinician can see that the AI has caught something and can explain it in the way that they normally explain it, because it's something that they do. Then there's additional kinds of tools that go beyond what people can do. And that becomes a little bit more difficult. And as Maryam mentioned, especially with deep learning and other kinds of machine learning techniques, there isn't a way just to trace back and say, this is how we came up with the answer. So in those kind of scenarios, I think it's even more important to provide the background of how the analytics performs overall. And also, one of the things that we have done is provide context that doesn't come directly from the AI answers itself, but fits in visually to say, how does this patient fit in with the population? So the AI came up with an answer, and then kind of as an aside thing, we provided these other layers of explainability of where the answer came from. And that's also something that is important to the FDA. So I think one of the FDA, in my opinion, has been great in getting AI approved in healthcare compared to some of the other things that have happened in the past, like with digital pathology. But that's really important for them, because I think it's important for us to understand it's a pretty important decision whether you're gonna have surgery or not. And if the robot just says, yes, you should have surgery, I'm out the door, like fast. So I think those are really key issues.
Yeah, but before moving on to kind of the next area around the areas that you all see for expansion for AI use within healthcare, I did want to kind of pose a similar type question back to Rohan in terms of, like, when you're selling your technology, it's not to clinicians, it's more to operators. And there's a big distinction in industry around, like, clinicians and operators. They do things very differently. They have different priorities. And so, like, in terms of how you get them to trust the technology, do you have like any insights you want to put out there?
Yeah, I think while we think that it's a little bit of an easier job, it's not. It's a completely different perspective. I do get the difference now, being in the rev cycle and the operational side, prior to my background being mostly on the clinical side. I think the message still stays the same, right? At the end of the day, an AI-based output, consider it as just another opinion that could be used in your decision-making process, right? So take, for example, if we think that, a registration process for getting a patient registered for a planned surgery is likely going to lead to them defaulting on their bill, and they're not going to be able to pay it. It's a very operational financial mindset. Somebody there is still going to want to know why we think that that is likely to happen, because the conversation is going to be, hey, should we start talking to you about a payment plan? And should we start getting in contact with other alternatives and options? And you might hit a nerve there. You might touch on something that's a little bit uncomfortable for the patient, and the patient might say like, why are you asking me that? But in the background, you don't know that we actually just did a soft lookup on their credit and looked at a bunch of information that is totally applicable and available under the HIPAA guidelines based on consent that's signed. So transparency and interpretability, I think, applies no matter where we go. It's a matter of how we present the information and the rhetoric that we use to say, look, you can choose to use this in your decision-making process. It happens to be an unemotional, unbiased, and bias is a huge thing when we talk about AI. That's an extra weapon in your decision-making process, right? So sure, it's easier on the ops side, but not 100%, a free walk.
Yeah. So I think that's a great discussion. And Srini, I was going to pose kind of the next question over to you around kind of like the evolution of AI, and feel free to add anything that you want to the last topic. But given your experience outside of the healthcare industry, like what type of technology that you've seen outside that have been adopted very widely would you like to see move into healthcare? And like, do you have any theories as to why they haven't? And so I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, one is, picking back on the discussion that we have, which is the role of AI and the trust and explainability. I'm a big proponent of that. In fact, there are some elements of AI where we believe in transparency and explainability, and making sure that there are no implicit biases that are coded into the algorithms is extremely critical. And that's why I'm a big believer in the initiative like the OpenAI, like what Elon Musk and actually talks about. I'm believing in the kind of the transparent AI is the way of the world. But at the same time, there are certain elements of AI, like deep learning. It's gonna come up with some patterns that we previously did not know about. If you actually look at the AlphaGo, the move, that is the pivotal point of the future of the AI. I mean, that's what AI shines the most. And metaphorically, and sometimes I refer to AI as a god. To me, God is like the chief data scientist. Right? There are so many patterns in the universe. We only know small, little, but everything has a pattern, right? And that's what AI with the deep learning is going to do, right? Just like there is always a method to the madness, right? And the AI with its just raw pixel-based, look, it actually has the best ability to stitch together the patterns that we did not know. In fact, there is a thing, right, which is like known AI-based outcomes. That is the diagnostics. And then the second thing is, unknown known, or which way you look at it, which is like the atypical neural networks that find some things like your voice acoustics is going to predict your cardiology. That is not something that probably is not taught in schools. That's purely a new insight that the deep learning uncovered, which we need to be able to be comfortable and using that as an augmented data point to make that. Now, how is this being practiced, or what's the right way to practice, whether it's on the clinical side or on the operator side? The way I look at it is there is an AI paradigm that is emerging, which is based on what decisions that you are comfortable by letting the AI system automate it, make independently. What decisions that you need an expert to actually finally approve it. Like, as what Rohan said, use that as a data point, but there are some decisions based on the negative impact. What if it did the wrong thing? What is the negative consequence? What's the downside? So those things you can actually delegate it to the system. And then, you move the expert decision making. A doctor needs to come and, finally approve a decision. And that's why we call AI still as an augmented era, not as a fully automated era. But at the same time, don't make that as a binary. It's based on the context, and always look at based on, like, for example, self-driving cars, right? The risk of a negative decision has a huge impact. So that's why you always try to put the human in the loop. In some cases where you don't put the human in the loop, right? So with everything that I'm seeing, even like, FDA is now understanding the AI, and they are actually implementing the fast track procedures to allow a faster certification or the pre-certification. I think, overall, we are all trending in the right direction to make AI as a significant part of, our way-to-way life. Now, what are the other technologies, that are going to complete this picture, right? One, what Rohan represents at Olive, like, RPA. RPA started as a legacy tool to connect the data systems that otherwise, did not have first-class APIs. In that case, you use the RPA as a bot, that moves the data around. And now RPA has become such an integral part, and it represents the intelligent automation across all industries. And now that has become a central part of it. To me, I look at the AI is now the reverse of AI is the IA. AI represents intelligent automation. And that includes both API-centric automation and the non-API-centric automation, which is what the RPA. So that's the first element. Because ultimately, what is AI about? I think Maryam talked about, which is like, we always focus on the technology, but AI is always, we need to start with the outcome. What is the outcome that we are trying to go after? And then what are the data sets? And it's just the data input that actually will facilitate it. It's no longer about an algorithm. Nobody needs to understand the complex algorithms. If you start with what is an outcome, what are the data sets, and why you can actually get it with the explainability and the biases, I think we are going to be in a great shape. The thing that I'm actually super excited about as the future of the technology is the AR, the augmented reality. I think the era beyond AI is AR. And that actually comes down to all the people around us to conceive the new world of experiences, right? As an example, COVID forced all of us to embrace telemedicine as a primary way of, taking care. If COVID weren't there, telemedicine was, you only used for very targeted, explicit cases when the patient is immobile. I always wondered, why do I have to cancel my entire work schedule to go see a doctor where they're going to ask me some spreadsheet like a flowchart like question, okay, what are you doing? And this, and then they will order a lab test based on that. I was like, dude, can't we simplify that with a phone call or just a FaceTime? And but the industry is self-protecting itself. Now, what the COVID did is like, with the virus had to come in where they basically had to force the telemedicine as the primary way of life. Now, just imagine, now we are all in the world, we are all communicating over video, and conferencing has become the primary modality and how we are collaborating. But now if you were to amplify that experience, like with AR, where it becomes like near physical kind of a presence where you can actually see the high fidelity. I'm super excited about the role of AR as an example, where the telemedicine becomes the primary modality of seeking care. And then the physical visit should be an explicit or as an exception when you cannot make that as an habit, right? And then it's not just about that, right? We should be able to even, things like in the COVID situation in Italy, when we are trying to prioritize which patients get the ventilator access, you should be able to visualize that entire using AR and supply matching patients to this, right? So there are so more imaginative experiences in the healthcare that I believe are going to occur. That is going to result in overall better healthcare experience. And ultimately, I'm super excited about the technology's role with AI, intelligent automation, and AR. And together, it's going to create these transformative experiences that both patients, doctors, and the supporting infrastructure as operators, we all will be super excited about.
Yeah, I appreciate kind of that overview. And then, I did want to kind of pose a question based on one of your comments to Maryam. So Maryam's team was kind of instrumental with Providence's telehealth effort during the COVID effort, during the front end of the COVID pandemic. And so I guess the question is, would AR or other type of AI type solutions been helpful during that period, or did you use any that were really valuable? And what are the ones that you wish you'd have? So I'll pass that to you. Sure,
absolutely. So for us, COVID became really real for my team the first week of March. Just for context, we were working on a platform. It's called DexCare, and we are about spinning it out as its own company. And DexCare, one of the modalities of care, Srini, is your favorite, is virtual visits that we had. And the volume basically during COVID, it was 30x. And let me tell you what we had to deal with. So, I got a notice on a weekend that, hey, this is looking real. The numbers are not looking good. So you got to get on a call this weekend to figure out how we are going to scale and what we are going to do with the volume of visits, or even all these consumers, patients who are worried. So there were a couple of things that right away we decided to focus on. One was we were working on a smart assistant, Grace. Her name is Grace. that basically helps navigate patients to the right modality of care and helps we had symptom tracker, helps them with appointment booking and all of that. And I thought, okay, we need to enhance Grace's brain with a COVID module. She needs to help with the worried patients. So right away we put it as a chatbot together, and there were two components to that. One is actually building all the workflows based on CDC guidelines and based on what our clinicians had, and saying in these pathways, which one of them needs to be monitored, who needs to get tested, and who needs to talk to a doctor right away. And that was very important for us, because just to give you context, we had patients who were waiting to talk to a doctor for 5 hours in a queue, which I could not believe, because they did wait and they did have that visit. So it was that bad. So this idea of having an assistant that helps the patient throughout their journey was really helpful. And in that, the technologies that we leveraged, natural language, NLP was obviously one of them. And we were lucky to, we had done our own language models and all of that previously, but I was actually in conversation with Microsoft because I wanted to make sure we can scale and my team can work on other things, not actually building an NLP platform. So that was really great for us to leverage what they had and put something together. That's just one aspect of it. Srini mentioned televisit virtual. One thing that folks may not know is that healthcare is very supply constrained. I mean, the ratio of doctors, providers to patients, I think in China is like 0.7 to 1,000 doctor to patients. In India is a bit better. I don't remember the exact number, maybe 1.5 to 1,000, and in US is 2.5 to 1,000. So let me tell you that we do, we do have a supply problem. So one of the components that we have built, even within the telehealth platform that we have, is intelligent routing and optimization of supply and demand. So how do we actually taking our supply into consideration and other signals, get the patients to get to the right modality of care. Now, Srini mentioned AR, and I definitely agree with him. I think there are use cases that's going to be essential for it. We didn't use it during COVID-19. Obviously, education of surgeons, that's like a no-brainer, and there are already solutions out there. But also during surgery, and this is a bit related to COVID, one of the things that I've been passionate about has been voice and sort of how do we make people hands-free, touchless, and COVID made it more real. And during surgery, how does the provider just gets what they need by voice and this augmented reality on top of what they're doing? I think that is really, really exciting and is really important as a technology for us. And the relation to COVID, like I said, is like get hands-free, get things augmented for you and bring voice to the picture.
Maryam, if I may add one thing that you touched on, which is very close to my heart, which is the role of assistants. I think wearables are going to play a bigger role in the future of the healthcare, because today, if you look at it, the only way we can scale or solve the supply problem is actually enabling more people to own part of their self-care.
Yeah.
Today, in fact, the healthcare is totally flawed because the healthcare focus is treating sick. In fact, the healthcare should go the other way, keeping people healthy. And the people need to own a big part of it. You know, the devices like Apple Watch, right? Now you can get your own EKG and, you know, on the thing, you know, just imagine the plight of getting your own EKG in the current world. Yeah. So I do believe that there are more and more dedicated assistants that are going to become part of our life, the wearables and the DIY kind of care. And that is going to result in a transformational industry. And then the doctor becomes the expert, where we'll not be supply constrained, and we will all come up with the overall better outcomes for the healthcare industry.
And you hit a really good point and related even to COVID, Cyril. So just some context for you, Srini, what was happening is, so these are all operational. So in the middle of, okay, putting something together, we are thinking, okay, patients who need to be monitored at home, how do we get them the devices and how do we make this automatic? And a part of me is like thinking, I wish everybody had already these smart devices and we could just make the magic happen. But in terms of RPM, remote patient monitoring, which by the way, the IoT is just one piece of it, but AI can also, to Srini's point, actually can continuously monitor, bring insights, predict, and again, prioritize those for a provider. But that was one of the key things that's missing. And our health system is actually looking at that very closely. We are not going to wait for another pandemic to hit to get on that. It's very important. And is the other part of it is, this is where, you know, you talked about what should AI do and what should providers do? You know, you talk about, is it in assisting, is it in augmenting, or is it in automation stage? And then which kind of task? Well, if there is all this wonderful data from IoT, from EMRs that comes, I think providers are going to be much more open to saying, I can't analyze this. This is a difficult task, right? It's either dull, dirty, difficult, or dangerous. I'm not going to be able to that. So I need you guys. So bringing IoT into the mix and all this data together, I think this is where you go. Yeah, AI definitely has a role. So I'm super passionate about it. I started working on Assistant in Microsoft, and then healthcare and Assistant is even much more interesting. So
yeah. So I guess kind of going off of that, I did have a question for Michael, because like your application for AI is kind of it's not at the IoT type level. Like this is like on the diagnosis type level. And so like, how do you feel about just general standard of care, and how a solution like yours, which is more on the image analysis, fits into that and kind of fits into kind of the new way of taking care of patients? So I'll pose that as kind of a general question, and feel free to comment on anything else that was said.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think I would tie it into what Maryam and Srini were saying a little bit by talking about, first, everybody's mentioned trying to avoid bias. And then the next sentence is, let's see what these people with Fitbits and Apple Watches are doing. So, I mean, that's something we absolutely have to think about. If you're going to really design a program where it's population health based, how do you ensure that everybody's getting the same level of entry into that test, into that care? And unfortunately, the pandemic has actually brought some of that to the forefront, because every single Seattle based kid has a laptop for doing interactive school, regardless of what their background is. And I think there's good sponsors for that. I'm not involved with the program, but it's just an example of how, in a fairly rapid time, if you have a big problem to solve, those things can come together. But specifically in talking about the image analytics, for instance, we have something that we're using for cancer diagnostic, where people have to go into an expensive machine in an expensive clinic and have an expensive doctor do the read. That right now is really not something that you can replace with something more inexpensive, because we're talking about lung. But there are newer technologies, newer imaging technologies that are built into iPhones, or there are startups that are working with ultrasound, where the quality has traditionally been very difficult to manage. The individual clinicians are not very good at getting the same images. But through the application of AI, in a way that ties together with AR, because you can imagine, in order to get the same kind of image, you have to augment the place where you're taking the image. You can see my shoulder here, for instance. You'd have to use AR in order to position the iPhone, in order to get the ultrasound that's attached to the iPhone in the right place, in order to get the right image that could then be analyzed. So I think some of those things are being pushed out. Unfortunately, you know, physics has some limits. You can't image at the microscopic level deep inside tissue, not very easily anyway. But I think we are making good progress in that direction. And you have to put that whole kind of stack together. It's about access. And if you start to address the access issue, then you think about also the training part of that. So, okay, so we sent a device to everybody, but does everybody understand how to use AR to get a picture of their shoulder? I think you know, I taught my mother what a computer mouse was 25 years ago. Yeah, so, you know, those things are surmountable, but they should all kind of be built into a top-down kind of program to start with those pieces of technology to solve individual problems.
Yeah, no, that's a good perspective. I did want to ask Rohan, just because a lot of the previous discussion has been focused on both kind of the consumer side as well, or the consumer patient side, as well as kind of physician side. like on the operational side, like what are the like impacts of something like AR or other type of like front end AI technologies that you feel can be really impactful, or maybe even ones that you've seen requested by some of your clients?
Yeah, I think, telemedicine, obviously, there's a clinical aspect to it. There's obviously the consumerization aspect to it. But if you're following the trend, and maybe Maryam, you have actual data on this, but, everybody thought that telemedicine is going to continue to have this insane, like rapid growth. But we're starting to see a lot of that trickle, potentially drop. I think if we can, I keep going back to healthcare, at least in this country, is heavily governed by reimbursement laws, right? And think about like, why did it take us so long to get telemedicine into the front of people who really, really wanted to use it, unless you were going to like concierge medicine or you were going to a fully employer-sponsored clinic. Most providers, and I worked at eClinicalWorks for a long time, one of the largest EMR vendors, and our business was primarily primary care doctors all over the country. And every one of them wanted to use telemedicine. They wanted to get as much of their market, but they couldn't because of reimbursement laws. So there is that aspect. I mean, healthcare at the end of the day is a services industry, right? And you exist to service your customer, because if you're not good at it, your customer will go somewhere else. There are operational improvements and efficiency gains that we can get through various different AI technologies. I am obviously biased now towards robotic process automation because to Maryam's point, integration is hard. EMR vendors will tell you that we have all of the open APIs and everything, but try to integrate with them. I mean, try to integrate into a health system that runs one of the top 3 EMRs, and it'll take you at least 9 to 12 months. How many startups have the budgets and the timelines to do that? They're gone. Their runway's over. Their investors like, you told me you could do this, and they walk away, right? So I am bullish on RPA potentially being the ugly hack to that problem by not breaching obviously any contracts and patient safety things, right? So
that's great. So we have okay, go ahead.
I am very big on RPA too. I actually reached out to Olive at some point because we were trying to capture insurance card information and figure out all the payment, and as you know, like sort of automate that whole process. And the APIs are not there. And at some point I asked myself, why do I need APIs if RPA can do it? So if it's so good, it's the new API.
I mean, the screen scraping and data scraping is the new way of doing things, right?
Yes,
But
exactly.
I think I stopped even referring to as an ugly hack. We just call this as intelligent automation. When there's API, you use it. Otherwise, you use a scraping, right? But it all does the intelligent automation.
Yeah, exactly.
So we have about 8 minutes left, and so I wanted to like shift the question onto each of you around like what are you thinking in terms of the future applications and kind of like the future state, I'd say, of healthcare and the AI utilization moving forward, and feel free to pick whatever timeline you want, like 3 months to like 5 years. I'm really curious to hear, and I'll pass it over to Michael. You could kind of kick us off, and then we'll kind of focus on getting everyone some chances.
Great. Yeah, I'm ready for this question. No, so I mean, I had a couple of thoughts on that. And for me, in this country, I've lived in Europe and other places. One of the things that we have to address in this global conference is payment and how things are organized. And a lot of places are much more simple than here. And that EMR question is also the way care is integrated is much better in a lot of other places. So I think for me, just thinking about what powers AI is data. The quality of that data is really, and again, the access issue is another point, because in a fully integrated healthcare system, everybody's using the same system. Everybody's data is in the same system, and you don't have that kind of issue. So I'm not going to pick a specific example of something that I think is the hottest thing. What I think is really important is that we're developing these verticals, these individual applications that demonstrate the value of having better integrated data, and pulling data from disparate sources is going to make that even multiply. So I think that's the real key. It's a process. It's I don't think ever ending, because different types of data are becoming available as you go forward. I think that's a really important factor.
I know, Srini, you mentioned a lot about AR. Like, do you feel that that's kind of a short-term type adoption within healthcare? Or do you feel like that's going to take longer? And it would be great to get your perspective on that.
I think AR is gonna, I mean, there are some low-hanging use cases, right? Like what Maryam talked about, telemedicine, and then places where we cannot do a touch kind of an environment. I think those become the low-hanging stuff. But I think some of those more transformative, imaginative experiences, it requires people to come up with what is the differentiated experience that's going to make a difference. I think we're going to see some of this telemedicine and the surgical or even learning. There I think AR delivers a better experience, and then continue on that. So one thing that I forgot to mention my disclaimer at the front, and I want to get it out there. Number one, everything that I share, Apple doesn't have any meaning to it. These are not Apple's views or my, these are strictly my views. So it's like just my passion. But I think the technology for me is, I'm super bullish about the AI, and I think if I were to paint the steady state, I think AI in the role of diagnostics, AI in the role of better clinical trials and facilitating it, and AI in facilitating overall value-centric outcomes with people taking a bigger responsibility, whether it's wearables and so on and so forth. I think truly if you can shift the pivot to, number one, people playing a bigger role in their self-care, with the wearables, and then AI guiding the rest of the flow, in terms of the operators and the clinics as an additional, more informed data point. And ultimately, I think, it represents a universal well-being where we shift the system to keeping more people healthy than treating sick.
Yeah. No, that's really insightful, and I hope that's the case, to be honest, because I think that's something that we need. So I guess Rohan, one question I have for you is, RPA has so many different applications, and I know that at Olive they have so many different ways to utilize it. Like, what do you feel is going to be kind of the low-hanging fruit there, like within kind of the short term, that you feel is just going to be adopted healthcare system-wide?
Yeah, I think, the best kind of AI is when you don't even know that it's AI. And I hope that, it's just like how we use our devices today. And the fact that Google Maps, nudges me on when I should go and pick up my daughter from school about 15 minutes away, when one day it says it's 35 minutes because the 520 is closed. It just, that's the kind of AI. And I think RPA has a really, really awesome opportunity to just do that stuff in the background. However, I think there is this world where there's a concept of like almost a baton exchange between multiple different quote unquote bots. And in the middle, there might need to be a human, right? So an RPA might take on a sort of mundane task, but just like humans, it's going to fail at certain things, right? It's going to fall sick. At Olive, we have this thing called, how many days was Olive sick? Like, when did she have a sick day? And we actually track that organizational wide for all of our customers and say, Olive had a sick day today. She didn't show up because something was wrong. And in a typical world, a human would tap on the shoulder of their manager or call in and say, guys, I'm not feeling too well today. Can you find a backup? We need to figure out a way that we can do that, right? So I'm really excited about this idea of potentially having bots talking to each other and potentially having a human influencing what decision they take based on almost like a recommendation system model. And I think that could be incredibly powerful for better patient registration, just overall patient experience, which ultimately helps health systems have their patients keep coming back to them for the quality of care that involves patient satisfaction.
Yeah. Maryam, it would be great to get your perspective on that, as well as kind of any predictions you have, just because that's an area that you've spent a lot of time in.
Sure, I will talk about the AI aspect of it. There's a whole lot that we are doing on the operational side, to Srini's point, basically thinking, how do we go from fee-for-service to value-based care? That's really gonna go move more towards health. But on the AI side, so my team is working on a smart assistant, and a lot of times people think about a chatbot. I almost don't dislike that word. The reason is that they think everything is about the speaking. I can see right now, so there is the vision aspect, there is the chat aspects, there is other signals that I'm receiving. Here I am. We don't talk about the smell, but even potentially actually smell, right, through IoT devices and all of that. So what I have in mind is a world where we have this set of isolated AI technologies coming together as one and actually powering smart assistants such as Grace. How do you actually bring them together? There's a technological angle to it. There's a usage angle. And in the short term, actually, our team is going to look at and see how do we bring computer vision and give some vision to Grace as well. So I'm excited about it.
Great, and appreciate that, and appreciate everyone on the panel for some great insights into the AI realm in healthcare, which is at its infancy in my mind. And so there's definitely going to be a lot of change in industry. And we got some great people on this panel to provide some insights to our audience members. And so with that, I'll pass it back to the conference team, and really appreciate the chance to be a part of this panel.
Sure, thanks for having me.
Sure, Cyril Philip, good